Hello and welcome to today's talk. My name is Brooke Little and I'm a PhD candidate in musicology at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And I specialize in women and music in Tudor England, particularly at court. In 2017, I completed my second master's degree in musicology and a thesis entitled The Musical Education and Involvement of the Six Wives of Henry VIII. But many of you may simply know me as Lady Tudor Music on Instagram. Well, let's go ahead and get started, and thank you so much for joining me today. In today's talk, we will be exploring the ways in which each of Henry's six queens brought to the Tudor court a continental musical influence through their patronage, musical ownership, practice, and personal enjoyment. Let us keep in mind that the Tudor musical complex was just that, an incredibly large system with many different personnel and departments. Today, I will be just giving us a sneak peek into each of the six queens and how they exercised a bit of their own personal influence as a cog in the royal music machine, and how their upbringings prepared each one of them to do so. As a rule of thumb, much of the time, the business of women's musical involvement was conducted within the confines of private, domestic, most of the time all female spaces. To get us started today, I thought I'd talk us through a bit about Catherine of Aragon's musical influence and upbringing in Spain under her mother's guiding hand, Isabella of Castile. While little evidence remains for Isabella's own musical training, receipts from Isabella's accounts describe the high monetary value she invested into surrounding herself in the court with stylish sound. This was especially reflective in the area of sacred polyphony in the Castilian royal chapel. The accounts state that Isabella took care to ensure her musicians had the physical items they needed for music making, including books of both sacred chant and polyphony. It seems that Isabella's encouragement of musical practices within the chapel went as far as correcting syllabic placement during chant rehearsal in order to perfect the singing of both her chaplains and the choirs. Lucio Marineo Siculo, an Italian humanist at the Spanish court, noted of Isabella's practice, saying, quote, "If any one of those who were saying or singing the psalms or other things of the church made any slip in diction or in the placing of a syllable, she heard and noted it, and afterwards, as a teacher to pupil, she amended and corrected it for them," end quote. For Isabella, the church acted as the great moral teacher for the predominantly illiterate Spanish people, and she ensured that her people were being instructed correctly in religion throughout the practices of sacred music. While Isabella's father, Juan II of Castile, was a noted musician, Isabella was the first monarch to precipitate the crown as an esteemed source of musical authority. The practice of monarchical correction of choral music continued into future generations of the Spanish crown. During the reign of Habsburg Charles V, it was said that he would not only correct the syllabic placement of chant, but he also took musical criticism a step further and even shouted at his choirs for singing incorrect notes. While neither Ferdinand nor Isabella instructed their children, the monarchs, especially Isabella, had a direct hand in overseeing their children's musical education through the intentional selection of singing tutors. Each of the five children, Juana, Isabella, Juan, Maria, and Catalina, were instructed at an early age by a singer from the royal chapel, such as Juan de Anchieta. Accounts of Catherine's own private singing education do not survive, unfortunately. However, Spanish court chronicler Fernández de Oviedo recalls Catherine's brother Juan in his own singing practices. Oviedo stated that, quote, "My Lord Prince Juan was naturally inclined to music and he understood it well, although his voice was not as good as he was persistent in singing, but it would pass with the other voices. And for this purpose, during siesta time, especially in the summer, Juan de Anchieta, his chapel master, and 4 or 5 boys, chapel boys with fine voices, who went to the palace, and the prince sang with them for 2 hours or however long he pleased to, and he took the tenor and was very skillful in the art," end quote. Catherine may have had similar experiences with musical education for several reasons. First, as Isabella oversaw the singing education of her 5 children, this may have provided some continuity in terms of those individuals employed as tutors in royal service. Specific suggestions for instrumental education and even musical educational methods. As a ruler in her own right, Isabella may not have sought to differentiate their instruction, since each of her children was being trained to be rulers. In addition to Isabella overseeing the singing education of her children, court records indicate that each household employed instrumentalists appointed by Isabella herself. Juan possessed an extensive instrument collection, showing Isabella's encouragement of instrumental education. Chronicler Oviedo noted once more that, quote, Juan's chambers were filled with instruments of all kinds, including the first clavier organ ever seen in Spain, and he knew how to play it well, end quote. However, although Juan and Catherine may not have had an entirely dissimilar instrumental education, it is important to note that Juan was being brought up as the future king of Spain and not as the future consort of the foreign nation. According to Catherine's biographer, Patrick Williams, quote, the girls studied music and learned to play the clavichord and other instruments, end quote. This attests to the fact that each of Isabella's daughters was acquainted with techniques on more than one instrument. Further evidence of Catherine's extensive background in instrumental music education can be found in the Spanish work El trágico destino de los hijos de los reyes católicos. While Oviedo commented on the impressive inventory kept by Catherine's older brother Juan, this book makes note of the collections held by Catherine's older sister, Juana. Further, this source offers explanation of Juana's education, mentioning that Juana was educated in subjects including Greek, Latin, canonical law, dance, and music. Among the instruments listed in Juana's collection, un llaviorgano, un manicordio, un templado de manicordio, una fijuela y 2 cajitas con unos alifarios were mentioned in the list. While there is no mention of Juana herself ever playing each of these instruments, she kept them in her collection. In 1501, Catherine arrived on the shores of England, where she was presented formally to her future father-in-law, Henry VII, and was officially contracted to her marriage to Arthur. Part of her first presentation before Henry entailed a ceremony where Catherine was unveiled, thus confirming to Henry that Catherine was not disabled. In effect, the dowry he was exchanging would be securing the future of the Tudor dynasty through childbirth on Catherine's part. After formal ceremonies, the couple was introduced in a large group, including each of their own entourages. The receipt of Lady Catherine details some of these first musical experiences the young couple would share. Quote, with the Lord Prince visited the lady in her own chamber, and then she and her ladies let call their minstrels, behavior and manner, and they solaced themselves with the disports of dancing. One of Catherine's first tasks upon arriving to England was a public dance performance and the demonstration of her Spanish ladies' musical talents through singing. While the account does not describe the exact dance that Catherine and Arthur performed, it does illuminate the precise manner of their dancing. Catherine was able to perform in a way that communicated to her new subjects her grace and manners, rather than ostentatiousness. As mentioned, dancing was one way in which Catherine could prove her health and vitality to the king, and therefore her ability to bear heirs to the throne. Upon her arrival to the English shores in 1501, Catherine's musical contributions went far beyond dancing for Henry VII and Prince Arthur. With her, she brought a large retinue of musicians, including the famed trumpeter, John Blank, pictured here on the Westminster Tournament roll. In addition to contributing a large musical entourage to the English royal court, just as Catherine is credited with bringing new clothing styles like the farthingale, she perhaps also brought with her new instrumentation such as the bile. As Catherine's life role changed from betrothed to married, her musical involvement transformed as well. Catherine moved from a musical role where she had to prove her fecundity through performance to that of an active audience member and musical host. As Queen Catherine was responsible for hosting diplomats in her private chambers. It was therefore her duty to ensure that her ladies in waiting had the skills necessary to entertain visiting dignitaries. The king would often conduct business or political proceedings in the Queen's chambers. Kate Van Orden suggests that it was music making in private monarchical spaces, worked first as a civilizer of nobles negotiating conflict. As such, the Queen's entertainment not only acted as a lovely distraction, but also allowed her to demonstrate both monarchs' magnificence. Finally, the Queen's private chambers were a more intimate space for mixed company to interact socially. After a banquet for the newly arrived French ambassadors, the king took one of the ambassadors to the Queen's chamber, where the Queen and her ladies amused the company. The chief of which, however, was the most approved by His Majesty, who was the instrumental music of the Reverend Master Dionysius Mimo, his chaplain, which lasted for 4 consecutive hours. Mimo's performance before foreign diplomats were opportunities for Henry to show off his virtuoso musician. When Catherine and her ladies, combined with the new musician Mimo, acted as impromptu entertainers for the ambassadors, they extended courtesy while displaying the sophistication of the English court. The Royal MS HG7 is a musical manuscript that reinforces Catherine's responsibility to provide England with an heir to the throne through its depiction of Catherine's symbol, the pomegranate, its fertility-themed texts, and its polyphonic settings of Marian praise. The collection was compiled in the workshop of Petrus Allemere in the southern Netherlands. Allemere's workshop is associated with the Mechlin court of Margaret of Austria, Catherine's sister-in-law and friend. It is possible that the manuscript was given as a gift from Margaret to Catherine and was meant to reflect not only their close personal connection, but also their parallel life trials and circumstances. The British Library places the manuscript's origins in the year 1513, although it is unclear whether that is the date of the presentation to Catherine or the manuscript's creation in Brussels. No other piece in the King's MS HE7 pays homage to Catherine's fertility better than the piece Descende in Oro Meum, attributed to Josquin Desprez. Like the other works of the manuscript, the best representation of this nod is found in the lyrics. The English translation of the Latin lyrics read, quote, "I went down into my garden so that I might see the fruits of the valley and see whether the vine had flourished and the pomegranates budded. Return, return, O Shulamite, that we might look to you. Alleluia." Let's go ahead and listen to a selection from the piece now, performed by Allemere, directed by David Skinner. y'all haven't already purchased this album, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's so beautiful and everyone should get it. But let's go ahead and continue on with our talk today and referring back to the text. First, the text references horticulture numerous times, including a garden, fruits of the valley, and flourishing vines, all which point to Catherine's ability to bear the fruit of England's womb. Next, and perhaps the most obvious, is the direct mention of the pomegranate and the attaching of the verb budded to Catherine's symbol. Finally is the reference to a Shulamite, who is the alluring female protagonist found in the Old Testament book of the Song of Solomon. Referencing the Song of Solomon was considered scandalous by religious officials, as it included direct references to sexuality and anatomy. However, the inclusion of this piece with its references to fertility and sexuality may have been specifically prescriptive for Catherine's behavior. What was most important to the English people, Henry and Catherine, was that she obtained a successful pregnancy. Next, and moving on to Anne Boleyn, a queen whose musical life continues to be a subject of fascination and mystery. However, let us begin by touching on the music education Anne would have received in the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France. As a foreign ambassador to the king, Thomas Boleyn had the connections necessary to place both of his daughters in prominent positions at foreign courts during their formative years. Both Anne and Mary began their educations as dames d'honneur to Margaret of Austria in the Netherlandish court of Mechlin Palace in 1513. Anne would have arrived at court around the age 13, and in addition to receiving musical training, which we will talk about a bit later, she would have learned the art of conversation, French, and possibly household management. In addition to practical skills for the aristocratic Tudor woman, Anne would have also learned other skills by observing Margaret of Austria, including the appreciation of fine art, humanist ideas, and new religious concepts. And she would have been surrounded by some of Europe's brightest minds and most talented artists and composers. In the early 16th century, Margaret of Austria kept a large retinue of musicians for both secular and sacred purposes. Musicians would have accompanied nearly every group gathering at court, including banquets, dances, mosques, private chambers, private mealtimes, mass, and even processional ceremonies and pageants. At the time, the Northern Court boasted one of the largest musical presences in Europe and was comparable to the courts of France and Italy. Margaret of Austria herself patronized many musicians, including Pierre de la Rue and Gaspar von Ferbeck, in addition to patronizing composers themselves, as well as ensuring the salaries of her chapel and court musical staff. Margaret of Austria supported her ladies-in-waiting with a broad musical education necessary for a young, stylish Renaissance woman highly involved in court life. Anne received formal education in singing, dancing, and instrumental music at Margaret's court. There are several candidates of who could have possibly been Anne's private instrumental music instructor, including Henry Bridemeyer, Antoine de Vitis, Marbrianus de Orto, or Govard Nepotis. Henry Briedemeyers has been the most popular assumption, as he taught the royal children of the court the manicordium and other instruments from 1508 to 1510. However, this date does not line up with Anne's age of commencing studies at the court by age 12 if she was born in 1501. Furthermore, Martin Picker emphasizes that Briedemeyers primarily taught the royal children and professional musicians in training. As a newly arrived member from a foreign court, and may not have yet had the social capital necessary to secure a prestigious teacher like Bredermers, who also taught Philip the Fair. Bredermers, like many musicians, may have linked his own social status to that of his student clientele, and therefore accepting a student of lower social ranking like Anne may not have been as appealing to him. Lisa Urkovich and Nicole Oches seem to agree that Bredermers was Anne's private music instrumental instructor. However, it is highly possible Margaret's retinue may have been responsible for instructing her ladies in waiting. Bredermers was the official organist of the chapel and of court, and would have primarily instructed on keyboard instruments. There is evidence that he also instructed on stringed instruments like the lute. There are possibilities that an alternative instructor may have musically tutored Anne at the Flemish court. Antoine de Vitis and Marbrianus de Orto were probably not Anne's instructors, as court records do not identify either specifically as a music teacher, although both musicians overlapped with Anne's time at court. However, Govard Nepotis, or possibly his younger relative, Fleurcran Nepotis, may have assisted the young Anne in her musical education. An organist, Jovard Nepotis, was a music teacher to Margaret of Austria herself, and in 1495, he received payment for instructing her in many instruments of music. However, since Jovard Nepotis instructed Margaret of Austria, it is highly unlikely he would have also taught a dame d'honneur. Therefore, Fleurcran Nepotis should be considered as a possibility. First, Fleurcran has been raised and taught in music and other studies under the supervision of Margaret. Next, he was later appointed as Henry Bredermer's assistant in 1516, which coincided with Anne's time at court. Further, Margaret required Fleuring to give both singing and clavichord lessons to her court fool. Surrounded at court by a large population of both vocal and instrumental performers and instructors, Anne would have been educated in both types of music making, including the clavichord, manicordium, lute, and other melodious instruments. In addition to learning to perform on instruments, Anne would have learned court dance, more specifically dances that integrated theatrical performances. Dancing and participating in court dance was one of the primary duties of the fille d'honneur. Thank you all for your patience with my French today as we go through this also. The Mechlin books of dance from this period include music for one of the most common dances of couples of the time, the Bassa dance. It was said that, quote, to dance it moves tranquilly without agitation in the most gracious fashion one is capable of, end quote. In addition to learning specific dances, Anne also learned the art of courtly love through pageantry and masks that accompanied dancing festivities. Often, the courtiers would perform dramas in costume, like knights and damsels in distress, alongside music and dance. The themes of these dramas often centered around an epic battle between male and female courtiers. It was here at the court of Margaret of Austria that Anne began her formal musical education and had her first introduction to incorporating dance into the art of the female courtly love performance. After a year spent in Mechlin, both Anne and Mary were recalled to assist Mary Tudor in her marriage to the French king at the court of France. There is very little, if any, contemporary evidence of either woman's time in France. There is a, quote, Mademoiselle Boleyn, who is mentioned in 1514 in the retinue of Mary Tudor during her wedding to Louis XII, although accounts do not specify whether the young lady was Anne or Mary. However, Lancelot de Carl, a French ambassador, published a poetic pamphlet in 1536 following the tragic events of Anne's execution, which details more specific events of Anne's time in France. Epistre Continental de la Roi Anne Boleyn d'Angleterre is a 1,000-line poem describing Anne's character from his own observations and his perspective as he witnessed Anne's execution and downfall. A few lines in particular describe some of the musical skills Anne demonstrated and presumably acquired while in France. Quote, elle savait bien chanter et danser, sonner de luth et d'autres instruments, which roughly translated means she could sing and dance well, and she played on many instruments. She was being shaped by the tastes of both Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France at the French court. Margaret was educated at the French court as well, so this may have further enriched Anne's own taste in secular chansons and French dances like the pavane and the galliard. At the French court, Anne would have continued to build on the musical and social skills she would have acquired at the court of Margaret of Austria. However, Queen Claude was a highly religious, somewhat reclusive monarch, so Anne's role as lady-in-waiting would have been primarily in attending on the Queen's needs through her many pregnancies. Although perhaps Anne may have performed for Queen Claude to entertain and amuse her, Claude in turn may not have been a strong model to emulate for musical performance. However, Anne would have been surrounded by the artistic environment of the French court, which also served as a great teacher. Anne may have encountered musicians such as Jean Moutin, Aragon de Thérèse, or even figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who was at the French court in 1516. She would have had 8 years to observe how female rulers used music to convey their own piety, to influence the court through the composers they patronized, or how to entice others through the court dance. Few positions of Anne still survive to this day. What does survive are 3 books of hours that gradually became more religiously progressive the later in life she owned them. Most importantly, an early 16th century manuscript called the MS 1070, also sometimes controversially called the Anne Boleyn Songbook by modern scholars, includes both secular and sacred vocal works that are primarily in Latin and French. Early researchers like Edward Lewinsky speculated about the specific time Anne owned the manuscript, arguing that she may have owned it after becoming queen. He even hypothesized alternative owners of the manuscript. Excuse me. Some 20 years later, Lisa Urkovich confirmed through a watermark study, sorry guys, that Anne did in fact own the manuscript prior to her queenship. More important than the timeline of Anne's ownership of the manuscript is the collection of songs contained inside. While the content of this songbook may reflect Anne's piety, it also imitates the pervasive musical taste of the French court. Furthermore, the small size of the manuscript indicates that it would have been used for domestic music making, for either solo or small ensemble use. Musicians such as Jean Moutin, Antoine Brumel, Loïsette Crompel, Clodoin de Semici, and even the famous Josquin de Pré make up the vast majority of the works found in the manuscript, and each either served with Louis XII or even Francis I. Let's go ahead and listen to one of my personal favorites of the MS 1070, performed by one of my absolute favorite performers of early music, Jouissance vous donnerai by Semici, performed by the very lovely and talented Jay Britton, or you may also know her as the Tudor Songbook on Instagram. And here we go. opinion, one of the finest performers of Tudor music in England today. But absolutely fabulous. If you haven't already followed her, please do so. She has listings for upcoming performances and is just an absolutely outstanding performer of Tudor era music. But let's continue on our journey. Much of what we know about Jane Seymour's education and musical involvement is based on conjecture. Her education was perhaps overseen by Lady Marjorie, and she may have also been taught by Sir John's chaplain. James, as he is referred to in Wolf Hall House account books, would have educated Jane in literacy and in spiritual knowledge. The Seymours, a prominent Catholic family, ensured that their children were raised properly in the faith. Being educated by a family chaplain, Jane would have been acquainted with the musical customs of the Catholic Church, although she had no knowledge in Latin. It is also possible that Jane may have been tutored in reading and writing at a local nunnery in the company of all female peers from other noble houses. As a prominent family, the Seymours did employ a number of musicians for their own family retinue. Like Jane Seymour, very little evidence of Anna Cleves' musical life survives. However, the German ambassador, Wotan, detailed some of Anne's favorable attributes, including mentions of her education and skills. Like a marital resume, Anne's characteristics were featured in such a fashion as to entice the king into marriage, shedding light on the education of early 16th century women. Duchess Maria, Anne's mother, oversaw her education by training her primarily in domestic skills such as embroidery and needlepoint. Wotan also mentions that Anne could speak and write in informal German, although she might have been able to quickly learn English upon arriving at court. In terms of her character traits, Wotan praised her gentle nature and that unlike her countrymen, she was ill-inclined in the drinking of spirits. Very telling of her musical involvement as a child, he noted that Anne could not, quote, sing or play any instrument, for they take it here in Germany for a rebuke, an occasion of lightness, that great ladies should be learned or have any knowledge of music, end quote. Although there is no record of Anne being musically educated, this does not mean that the Juilliard Cleves court was completely devoid of musical enjoyment. A record in the Archivelisches zur Geschichte der Musik von Cleves Jüchlich confirms that the Juilliard Cleves court supported an 8 to 10 member orchestra with additional singers that the Duchess of Cleves herself, again Anne's mother, tended to favor the music of the harp. With these musical surroundings, Anne would have been versed in the importance of her role as an audience member. It was through her attendance at performances that Anne would have acquired the listening and intellectual skills necessary to converse about music. Once she learned English with her famously musical husband, Henry VIII. Negotiations for the marital union between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves concluded in September of 1539. Even from England, Henry sponsored a lavish banquet with court entertainments for the visiting German dignitaries on September 23rd, celebrating the conclusion of the negotiations. The traveling party was expected to be received well by the English people, and documents mention the musical expectations of a triumphal procession entry to the English shores. Anne's brother-in-law loaned her 13 of his own trumpeting musicians, which were to announce her arrival to each town the party passed along the way. The court of Cleves and similar foreign courts would hire an increased number of musicians to prepare for ceremonial processionals like Anne's, thus adding to their own spectacle and prestige. Anne's reception at Antwerp was particularly popular, according to updates given by Wotan to Cromwell, who updated the king on Anne's progress through Europe. However, later in 1540, a man named Richard Pate informed the king that the pageants that had been rehearsed and prepared for Anne's arrival had to be canceled because of inclement weather. Thus, Anne's trumpeting entourage was solely responsible for gaining attention and royal prestige, as she traveled to her new home. Anne's processional escort was comprised of 263 people and 228 horses, including the German trumpeters, who requested to accompany Anne to England. Even before arriving on English soil for the first time, Wotan approved a request from Southampton to welcome Anne with trumpet music led by the English musicians. One such musical pursuit that Anne made a study of following her divorce was dance. As a German princess and then English queen, Anne's involvement in dance was quite minimal. However, separation from the king gave her the time to learn pastimes that were considered frivolous during her education in Germany. On New Year's Day, 1541, the Lady Anne, as she was styled, was presented before the king and queen at celebrations, the then Queen Catherine Howard. After being presented to their highnesses, King Henry left the festivities to rest in his private chambers, and both Queen Catherine and then the Lady Anne were left to host the New Year's festivities at court by themselves. It's Gareth Russell who indicates that, quote, Catherine and Anne danced a duet together before the revelers were invited to join them, end quote. The account describes Lady Anne and Queen Catherine choosing men from the king's private chambers staff to dance with, while attired stylishly in the popular English court fashions. This event would have taken place exactly a year after Anne's first arrival to England. Anne's transition from Wotan's account of her having no knowledge of music, singing, or dance to a richly dressed woman leading others in a court dance would have been a drastic change. Okay, next we have Catherine Howard, who we see here. Her musical involvement and education was quite indicative of the Tudor upper class woman of the time. There are several reasons why Catherine herself would have received a musical education. Foremost, for the Howard family, Catherine's musical education prepared her to serve in the household of her cousin, at the time, Queen Anne Boleyn. Biographers of Queen Catherine point out that the lack of evidence that any other girls at Chesworth House, where she was raised, received music lessons, which suggests that the Duchess singled out Catherine to receive such an education. Catherine was selected for her beauty, grace, and pleasing manners, all valuable assets enhanced by musical education. The Duchess needed to ensure that, in addition to a pleasing countenance and behavior, Catherine would have had the musical skills required to ornament the famously musical queen's household. Giving Catherine musical skill was a further scheme to heighten Catherine's sexual allure, which enhanced her prospects of finding an advantageous marriage. Her music lessons would have represented a considerable financial investment on the Duchess's part, supplying both instruments and books. In return for the Duchess's financial investment, she would have expected Catherine to marry in a way that would enhance the social status of the Howard family as a whole. Typical of a Tudor noblewoman, she was trained on both lute and virginals. These instruments were chosen specifically for young women, as there was very little reason for either to insinuate any kind of sexual act or innuendo. Furthermore, when played, both of these instruments projected the ideal volume level for entertaining indoors in small spaces, like the ones found in the Queen's apartments at court. Let's go ahead and on to our very last queen. Lastly, we have Catherine Parr, who, like her predecessors, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, significant evidence survives suggesting Parr's musical prowess as queen. Catherine Parr was born in 1512 as daughter to Sir Thomas and Lady Maud Parr. At the time, the Parr family seat of Kendal Castle was derelict, and therefore Catherine was more than likely born just outside of London. Sir Thomas Parr served in Henry VIII's household during his coronation procession celebrations, which was inducted into the Knights of the Orders of the Garter. Although Catherine's education, like other young girls of her station, was particularly centered around domestic skills, music became a poignant part of Catherine's training. In addition to lessons in vocal music, where Catherine performed in many languages, she was also well versed in instrumental music. According to C. Fino Hoffman Jr., Catherine demonstrated that, quote, skillful playing in three instruments, viol, lute, and the virginals, end quote. The skills Catherine received in her education would have prepared her for a life at court, serving the queen in her private chambers. Maud Parr ensured that Catherine acquired the skills necessary for Catherine to make a success in the queen's domestic sphere, much as she had done. Although the last of Henry's 6 wives, Catherine Parr's musical education reflects the culminating feminine influence of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the sixth queen's namesake and later godmother. As a lady-in-waiting at the early Tudor court, Lady Maud Parr, Catherine Parr's mother, was a first-hand witness to the newfound educational advances being given to young women. Maud observed the musical education of Catherine of Aragon's daughter, later Mary I, and even noticed the education given to Sir Thomas More's daughters. Catherine of Aragon championed female musical education and ensured that Mary received private lute instruction. This sense of generational musical taste modeling would pass down through Maud, manifesting in Catherine's patronizing the most exquisite musicians available at the late Henrican Tudor court. Catherine fully embraced her new role as queen by cladding herself in imperial dress, surrounding herself with exotic diversions, such as a retinue of parrots, and through the musicians she employed. However, what may have promoted her status were the various musical entertainments for which she called. One of the first ensembles she added to her household was a company of Venetian minstrels and from the famed Bassano family. However, the family of instrument makers were indeed patronized by Catherine's brother William first in 1541, and then upon entering into marriage with Henry VIII, the patronizing was transferred to Catherine herself in 1543. While there has been some speculation as to the family's religious status as crypto-Jewish Catholics, they rose to prominence and found safety in the household of the queen. In addition to the Bassano family, Catherine also patronized an additional consort of viol players from Milan and Venice, whom she paid 8 ducats daily. The Bassano family took up residence in Charterhouse, London, after the victims of the Carthusian martyrs of London were executed. Catherine helped to educate Henry's children and devoted her resources especially for their musical education. When Catherine married Henry, his eldest Mary was just over 3.5 years her junior. Elizabeth was 10, and Edward, the future King of England, was just over 6 years old. Catherine's involvement with Mary's musical pursuits can be described more as a mentor. In a letter dating from September 1544, Catherine wrote to Mary and referred to the letter bearer as a man who was skilled in music. In her letter, Catherine noted that his musical skill made him more acceptable, because, like herself, Mary took as much delight as myself in the musical arts. This confirmation is not surprising, as both Catherine and Mary were greatly influenced by Catherine of Aragon's courtly musical pursuits, both in terms of education and enjoyment. Catherine inadvertently encouraged Mary's own performance, especially in terms of dance. I'm going to go ahead and move myself over here. In an event honoring the visiting Duke of Nájera, Catherine first introduced her musicians, took to the dance floor with the Duke himself, and then invited the Princess Mary to dance. Mary emulated Catherine's performance, and through Catherine's modeling, received appropriate instruction in the proper relationship between regal women and music performance in the public sphere. Edward, however, cautioned both ladies in such a display, saying that they must not, quote, attend any longer to foreign dances and merriments which do not become a Christian princess, end quote. In contrast with Mary, Catherine's fervent Protestantism affected her approach to the education of both Elizabeth and Edward through the Protestant tutors she appointed for them. Prior to 1543, Edward lived among the women, or mostly among women. Catherine often wrote Edward praising his diligence in his studies. She encouraged him in the wide variety of scholarship, saying, quote, "With what great diligence you have cultivated the muses," end quote. In 1543, under Catherine's supervision, Richard Cox was appointed as Edward's official tutor and educated him in the subjects such as literature and Latin. Edward was educated with other boys from noble houses, where they would have also learned dance and music along with their other studies. Cox also led Edward into contact with musician and music master Christopher Tye. Tye later composed the Acts of the Apostles in 1553, which is a collection of educational Protestant hymns now found in the Lambeth Palace Library. The work was dedicated to Edward and features 4-part vocal works written in English that also convey various biblical stories, including the New Testament and accounts of Ananias and Sapphira. Catherine Parr's most significant relationship was arguably with Elizabeth. Unlike Edward, who had his own household and establishment away from court, Catherine suggested that Elizabeth take up lodgings in the court instead of at Hatfield House. Catherine also supervised her education and later chose a tutor with close connections to the Parr family, Roger Ascham. Catherine also approved of the continual presence of Cat Ashley, Elizabeth's governess at court. Cat was responsible for educating the princess in a number of subjects, including dancing and music. Perhaps Catherine's most significant musical contribution to Elizabeth was in modeling a cult of majesty created by surrounding herself with en vogue musical resources. The young Elizabeth would have witnessed Catherine's Venetian minstrels, her consort of viols, and the other musical ensembles that followed the queen around court. It is no coincidence that, in turn, Elizabeth used music and musicians for propaganda during her own reign, especially to bolster the illusion of her own supernatural queenly powers. Thank you all again for joining me, and I very much hope that you enjoyed today's talk. Please feel free to follow me on Instagram at Lady Tudor Music or DM me with any questions you might have about today's talk. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.